But charges against former President Donald Trump remain under seal for now. Sources tell NBC News that they include a violation of the Espionage Act, which has to do with retaining sensitive national defense information. To break this down, let's bring in former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes and former CIA Director John Brennan. So, Director Brennan, important to note here, you can still violate the Espionage Act regardless of whether the information is classified, as long as it is national defense information, according to the statute. Can you clarify the importance of all of that?
Well, the government has taken great precautions as far as making sure that our national security secrets, that which keeps our country safe and secure, all material related to it needs to be kept under special arrangements in terms of what's called a Special Compartmented Information Facility, a SCIF, because there's such sensitive information that could be collected from sensitive technical collection systems or human networks around the world. And so the Espionage Act is the mechanism that can hold someone accountable for unlawfully and intentionally retaining those documents, because the concern is if they're left in an unsecured manner or facility, they can be accessed by individuals who have not only no right to them, but also could do damage with them. And I think one of the things that we're all very curious about is whether or not Jack Smith has uncovered evidence that Donald Trump actually shared that information with others. But again, irrespective of whether it was shared, just the unlawful retention of those documents in an unsecured manner is sufficient to bring somebody under indictment for a violation of the Espionage Act.
So, Ben, there's been a lot of talk by lawyers, but also by members of Congress and others who support Donald Trump that this isn't a big deal. And they give a shrug to what was found. These are papers. These are things that he had. And I'm wondering, what is the danger to national security? Why does this Espionage Act even exist?
Well, a number of things. First of all, we'll see what was in those documents, right? And all those people are saying this isn't a big deal. Once we learn more about this information, it's going to be pretty telling, because some of the reports are that it could have been quite sensitive information. It might not have just been like letters that he kept from foreign leaders. But in terms of the dangers, Chris, and to build on something John said, first of all, if it wasn't a big deal, when he was asked to return the documents, he would have returned them. He obfuscated, he kept these things. It seems like he obstructed efforts to get them based on the variety of indictments here. And it's a big deal for a number of reasons. First, the entire integrity of the system, of the United States having a national security apparatus, having an intelligence community, depends on people not doing what Donald Trump just did. And if you send a message that you can take the most sensitive information that the U.S. government has out of secure facilities, that you can have it in private residences, that you can fail to comply with the request to return it back. What message does that send up and down the chain of all the many people that are working with this information in the U.S. government? It just suggests that there's really nothing to this regime. And Donald Trump is making a mockery of it, as he has with so many other things. I think the second thing, though, is that there's very real risks. Mar-a-Lago is not a secure facility. Not only is it not a SCIF, as John said, a secure compartmented information facility, it's a place where all manner of people are wandering through there. It has likely been the #1 intelligence target for America's adversaries since Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. We don't know if he shared this with people. We don't know how these documents were secured. We don't know how they might have been compromised. There are a lot of countries that would like to know what was in that information. And so the worst case scenario is that U.S. sources and methods, U.S. partners, they're put at risk by this, that information that we want to remain secret, plans that the United States government may have that are of great interest to our adversaries, that those could have been compromised as well. And the last piece is, and John can speak to this as well as any person that's out there, we need allies to trust us. We need sources to trust us. The entire national security apparatus depends on other countries thinking that the United States is a reliable partner. And if you've got the kind of most sensitive information in the government just hanging out down in Mar-a-Lago, well, that sends a message to other countries. That sends a message to human sources. That sends a message to anybody that might want to work with us that we can't be counted on. And that's a real risk. That's not something to make fun of. It's not something to play politics with. And all these people that are rushing to defend Trump by diminishing this are diminishing the importance of U.S. national security.
It's also a lot of people who are making a very big deal of Hillary Clinton's emails back in the 2016 campaign. I know we want to get the legal analysis on this, but I do want to get the national security analysis on this from you, Director Brennan, and that is what Donald Trump was reportedly on tape saying about the document that he knew was classified. This has been reported now by a number of outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, talking about a document that pertained to Iran and pushing back on General Milley, saying that Milley prepared all this information for me in order to attack Iran. Here, I've got a document in my hand. I'm paraphrasing. It's classified, highly classified. What about, and he admits that he can't declassify it now that he's not in the White House, according to CNN at least. But what about the substance of it, that he's talking about Iran, that he's talking about Milley's plans to attack Iran? That seems like it might be an issue.
Well, it's clear that his comments show that he knows that he didn't have the authority post-presidency to share this very sensitive information. And he was emphasizing the sensitivity of it. So again, it shows the intentionality, which I think is one of the reasons why charges are being brought against him about something as so important and so sensitive as possible war plans against a foreign country. And again, picking up on Ben's point, we rely on a lot of our allies and partners in order to carry out any type of military operations. And exposure of that really undermines the confidence of others in our ability to actually do these things. And moreover, I find it totally outrageous that Republican members of Congress today are continuing to embrace Trump and trash the Department of Justice. I find that just outrageous, how they could do that. In light of all the things that have come out, Trump's public acknowledgement about his intentional and unlawful retention of these documents, they are sending a message throughout this country and around the world that really calls into question our system of justice here in this country. So they're denigrating the national security aspects of this case. They are trashing the Department of Justice as well as FBI and others. And so, again, it shows the poisonous influence of Donald Trump over the last number of years and how it has affected others, such as a former member of the Navy, Walt Nato. Those who have brought into his orbit and for whatever reason decide to continue to apologize, make excuses, and endorse and support his very unlawful, dishonest behavior.
And just a note on that, that the Department of Justice did not bring these indictments. The special counsel law actually precludes Merrick Garland, Lisa Monica, any of those appointed officials from getting involved in any way unless the recommendation from Jack Smith was so outside the parameters of the special counsel law and of the Justice Department law that then he would step in, Merrick Garland, and the Attorney General would write to Congress. So just to ratify that point. Ben Rhodes, I want to ask you about something that Donald Trump told Sean Hannity on Fox last September, that he can declassify materials by just thinking about it. Let's listen.
It doesn't have to be a process, as I understand it. You know, there's different people say different things, but as I understand, there doesn't have to be. If you're the president of the United States, you can declassify just by saying it's declassified, even by thinking about it, because you're sending it to Mar-a-Lago or to wherever you're sending it. And there doesn't have to be a process. There can be a process, but there doesn't have to be. You're the president. You make that decision. So when you send it, it's declassified. I declassified everything.
Now, according to this indictment and according to the law, the Espionage Act, the documents don't have to be classified. We've just established that if they're defense information. But you dealt with classified documents all the time as the Deputy National Security Advisor in a SCIF. Just describe the process by which the President of the United States declassifies that you dealt with Barack Obama, the process involved, rather than just mental telepathy.
No, well, John and I both worked on this, and I often had to work on this because if President Obama wanted to discuss something publicly, for instance, that had been classified, we absolutely went through a process. We'd meet about it. We'd discuss the parameters of what he could say. You would want to do a check to make sure that what he said wouldn't point to the sources and methods by which certain intelligence might have been collected. Exhaustive process in order to declassify something. I think what is so telling in the report that was cited in the question to John, right, the Iran war plan, though, is that's not subtle at all. Like, those are the most sensitive. Those documents often, something like that, just hypothetically, are the kind of documents you would not even take out of the Situation Room. You would not be taking that home. You would not be walking around with that. And so we're talking about potentially very serious and sensitive stuff that Trump himself may have acknowledged he didn't declassify before leaving office. And I just want to make the point, if he was sharing it in the incident that was reported, right, that he was sharing this with some biographers or something, who else was he sharing it with, right? And there clearly had been no process to mitigate the harm of that information being unsecured. The reason you have declassification processes is to mitigate harm. None of that was done in this case, and that put U.S. national security at grave risk.
Ben Rhodes, John Brennan, great having you both on the program.